She had been invisible for 3 years. Invisible when Dr. Harlan Voss talked over her in rounds. Invisible when the charge nurse handed her the worst assignments without explanation. Invisible when she flagged a patient's deteriorating vitals and was told to let the doctors handle it. But when a 200-pound Navy SEAL hit that trauma bay floor with a femoral bleed that was eating him alive, when every physician in that room stood frozen, calculating liability instead of moving, the invisible woman stepped forward. She didn't ask permission. She didn't introduce herself. She pressed her knee into his thigh, shoved a gloved hand into the wound, and said 4 words. "Everyone else, back up." And the room obeyed. If this story moves you, follow my channel, hit like, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Let's begin. Harlan Voss arrived at Sutter Ridge Medical Center every morning 7 minutes early, and he made sure everyone noticed. He parked in the same spot, the one closest to the physician entrance, the one with the small painted "reserved" that he'd lobbied administration to approve 3 years ago. He walked through the ER with his badge already flipped outward and his coffee from the place 2 blocks over, never the hospital cafeteria. Because detail mattered, perception mattered. He'd built an entire career on the architecture of being seen correctly. Emily Doss was not built that way. She took the bus. She arrived through the main entrance with everyone else, with the families clutching insurance cards and the overnight janitors finishing their shifts and the orderlies who'd been running since 4 in the morning. She wore her dark hair pulled back in a knot that didn't require a mirror to execute. She had a small scar on her left forearm she'd never explained. She did her job and she went home. And she had done this for 31 months at Sutter Ridge without complaint, without ceremony, and, as far as most of the senior staff was concerned, without particular distinction. That was the version of Emily Doss that Sutter Ridge Medical Center in Denton, Montana had decided to see. A trauma nurse in her late 30s. Former military, sure, but the kind of former military that meant she could handle a difficult IV line and didn't cry during codes. Reliable. Competent enough. Nothing worth writing about. Dr. Voss had a different word for her. Several, actually, though he kept most of them to the physician's lounge. "She's a liability," he told Dr. Patricia Marlowe, the head of trauma surgery, during a staffing meeting 2 weeks prior. "She contradicts attending physicians in front of patients. She documents things nobody asked her to document, and she has this energy, like she's waiting for everyone to admit she's running the department." Marlowe had looked at him over her coffee. "She flagged the Kessler patient's pressure drop 40 minutes before his code. That's not liability, Harlan. That's nursing. That's not the point." Then what is? He hadn't answered. He didn't need to. Patricia Marlowe was the head of trauma surgery, but Raymond Steck was the hospital director, and Raymond Steck was the kind of administrator who valued harmony above accuracy, who valued institutional cohesion, who had made it abundantly clear in the last budget meeting that Sutter Ridge could not afford another joint commission review, another physician complaint, another anything. Raymond Steck liked smooth. Emily Doss was not smooth. She showed up on the Tuesday in question at 6:48 in the morning. She'd taken the 6:15 bus from the east side of Denton, which meant she'd been awake since 5:15, which meant she'd slept about 4.5 hours after an evening spent reviewing the department's quarterly incident reports, which she had no formal obligation to review, but which she read anyway because the pattern in Bay 3's monitoring equipment had been bothering her since October. The ER was already running behind. 2 overnight traumas had backed up the admit flow, and the day shift was inheriting a department that smelled like stress and burned coffee. Emily signed in, grabbed her assignment sheet, and scanned it in approximately 4 seconds. Bay 7, pediatric overflow. A 63-year-old with possible bowel obstruction. Post-op check on a knee replacement in Bay 2. She was halfway to Bay 2 when Voss materialized at her shoulder. "Doss." She didn't stop walking. "Dr. Voss, the Hendricks patient in Bay 7 needs a NG tube. I documented the order at 6:30. I saw it. I'd like it done in the next 15 minutes. It'll be done." She pushed open the curtain to Bay 2, glanced at the patient, 70-year-old man, knee elevated, color decent, and began her check. Behind her, she could feel Voss still standing there, deciding whether to say something else. He opted not to. That was the thing about Voss. He picked his moments. He was strategic in the way that people who have never had to be brave often are. She managed all 4 of her assigned patients before 8. She caught a medication discrepancy on the bowel obstruction patient, a dosage entered incorrectly by the overnight resident, and flagged it through proper channels, which meant a note in the chart and a direct message to the attending. The attending, a Dr. Foley she barely knew, sent back a 2-word reply. Already caught. He hadn't caught it. But Emily wrote nothing further. This was also part of the job. By 9:30, Sutter Ridge's ER was running at 91% capacity, which in Denton, Montana in November was not unusual. The nearest Level 1 trauma center was 80 miles south. Sutter Ridge handled what it handled because it had no choice, and what it lacked in resources it attempted to compensate for with protocol, hierarchy, and the kind of institutional confidence that sometimes bordered on delusion. At 9:47, the radio call came in. Emily was charting at the nurse's station when the overhead crackled. Dispatch. Vehicle collision on Route 9, multiple casualties. 2 critical. ETA 12 minutes. One of the critical patients was described as a large male, mid-30s, penetrating trauma to the right upper thigh, hemorrhage control in progress by bystanders, blood pressure already tanking. She set her pen down. Voss materialized again. He was good at materializing, and took the radio report from the charge nurse with the practiced ease of a man stepping into a spotlight. Get Trauma 1 prepped. I want Marlowe paged if she's in the building. He turned to the assembled staff with his particular brand of authority. Let's move, people. This is what we train for. Emily was already moving, but not in the direction he expected. She went to the supply room. She pulled a tourniquet, a hemostat, a pressure dressing kit rated for high-volume trauma. She had her hands on a second tourniquet before she consciously registered that she'd done it. Old habit. Old deeply grooved habit. She was back at Trauma Bay 1 in under 90 seconds, and she spent the next 10 minutes doing what she always did in the minutes before a critical patient arrived. She restructured the room, quietly, without being asked. The crash cart was 2 feet from where it should be relative to the bed angle. The suction setup was fine, but the tubing was kinked near the base, which nobody had noticed. She straightened it. She confirmed the IV supplies. She checked the lighting. Voss noticed her rearranging. His jaw tightened. "Doss, I didn't ask you to scrub into this." "I'm assigned to the ER, Dr. Voss. Trauma 1 is a physician-led response. You can assist in Bay 2 when overflow arrives." She looked at him. He was already looking away, back toward the doors, composing his face into the expression he wore when he expected to be watched. She stayed where she was. The ambulance bay doors opened at 9:59, and the world contracted to a specific kind of noise, wheels on linoleum, the clipped language of paramedics transferring command, the ambient machinery of controlled emergency. The first gurney carried a woman in her 50s, head lack, conscious and frightened but stable. The second gurney carried a man who was none of those things. He was enormous. 6'2", at least 220. Built the way people are built when their body is their professional instrument. His tactical pants had been cut away at the thigh by the paramedics, and the pressure dressing they'd applied, a good one, Emily noticed, military grade, was soaked through. His face had the gray-white cast of someone whose body was beginning to make decisions without consulting him. His eyes were open but not focused. Marcus Webb, 34, penetrating trauma right upper thigh, suspected femoral involvement, the lead paramedic said, not slowing. 2 large-bore IVs in transit, 1 liter saline in, pressure 58 over palp and dropping. He arrested briefly in the rig, got him back. GCS is 12, Emily said. She was already at the bedside. She had her hand on his wrist, his real pulse, not the monitor reading, and she was counting. Voss stepped forward. "I'll take report." "GCS is 12, Emily said again, not to Voss, to the room. "He's protecting his airway, but he won't be much longer. Femoral bleed that's been pressure dressed for 11 minutes is still soaking through. That means either the dressing placement is suboptimal or we have proximal involvement. We need a tourniquet high on the thigh, and we need it right now before he loses another nurse." Voss's voice had dropped into a register that he used for correction. "I'm leading this resuscitation." She looked at the dressing. She looked at the clock. She looked at Marcus Webb's eyes, which had just gone slightly wrong. The particular dimming that she had seen a specific number of times in a specific number of places that had nothing to do with Montana. His pressure's crashing, she said. If we don't, I can see the monitor, Doss. Step back. And the room waited. Because that was what rooms did when a physician with authority and volume told them to wait. They waited. They deferred. They trusted the hierarchy because the hierarchy was all they had. Emily Doss did not step back. She reached across Marcus Webb's body, took the tourniquet she'd staged during her prep, and began applying it. "What are you—" Voss started. "High and tight." She wasn't talking to him. She was talking to her own hands, the way she used to talk to her hands in places where there was no trauma bay, no overhead lighting, no crash cart positioned at the correct angle. High and tight, as proximal as you can get it, and then you crank it until the bleed stops. And you write the time on his forehead in marker because he is going to surgery if we keep him alive long enough to get there. Someone handed her a marker. She didn't look to see who. She tightened the tourniquet. Marcus Webb made a sound, involuntary, guttural, and his whole body contracted. His blood pressure reading on the monitor, which had been skidding toward incompatible with consciousness, stabilized, didn't improve. Stabilized. "Someone get Marlowe," Emily said. "He needs the OR in 20 minutes. The room was very quiet. Voss said, "You just violated. He arrested once already." She was checking the dressing, checking the tourniquet placement, checking his pupils. "He's going to arrest again if that femoral isn't controlled in a surgical suite. What do you want to argue about first?" One of the residents, a young man named Torres she'd worked beside for 4 months, moved to the phone. He called the OR. He called Marlowe's direct line. He did it without being asked by Voss, which was notable. And he did it with the focused efficiency of someone who had just watched something that recalibrated his understanding of the room. Voss stood at the foot of the bed with his arms at his sides. The next 18 minutes were ugly and precise. Emily managed Marcus Webb's pressure through fluid resuscitation and positioning, caught a secondary site bleeding at the wound margin, and controlled it manually until Marlowe's team arrived, and monitored his neurostatus with the kind of continuous attention that required her to be in 2 places at once, which she'd learned, in a different life, was not actually impossible if you'd practiced enough. Marlowe arrived in scrubs, already gloved. She assessed the situation in approximately 10 seconds. Her eyes went from Marcus Webb to the tourniquet placement to Emily. "Good application," she said. Just those 2 words. Then she began issuing pre-surgical orders. Marcus Webb was wheeled to the OR at 10:17. His blood pressure, when he left Trauma Bay 1, was 84/50. It was not good, but it was enough. Emily stood at the bay entrance and watched them go. Her gloves were dark with blood. Her hands were steady. Behind her, she was aware of the particular silence that follows a near miss, the kind of quiet where people realize what almost happened and can't quite find language for it. She peeled off her gloves. She dropped them in the biohazard bin. Voss was still in the room, He hadn't moved from his position at the foot of the bed. His coffee, the good stuff from the place 2 blocks over, was sitting on the counter behind him, untouched since before the ambulance arrived. "My office," he said. "When you're done." She was documented back in at the nurse's station by 11. Torres gave her a look she couldn't quite read. The charge nurse, a woman named Bev Quarles, who had been running ER nursing operations at Sutter Ridge for 9 years, met her eyes for just a moment, and then looked deliberately at her screen. Emily knew what that meant. She'd been in enough rooms to know what the quality of a silence meant, but she didn't know the extent of it yet. She didn't know that while she'd been keeping Marcus Webb's blood inside his body, Raymond Steck had been called from a budget presentation 2 floors up. She didn't know that Voss had sent a text from the trauma bay during the active resuscitation, to Steck's direct line. She didn't know what the text said. She found out at 11:40 when she was called not to Voss's office, but to the executive conference room on the 4th floor. Steck was there. Voss was there. A woman from Human Resources named Diane Pryor, whom Emily had met once at an orientation 4 years ago and hadn't spoken to since, was there with a manila folder on the table in front of her. There was no chair set out for Emily. "We'll keep this brief," Steck said. He had the manner of a man who had rehearsed brief and wanted credit for it. We've reviewed an incident report filed this morning regarding your conduct in Trauma Bay 1. An incident report, she looked at Voss. Filed this morning. Filed after the incident, yes. Steck's tone indicated that the timing was not a subject for discussion. You overrode a physician's direct instruction during an active resuscitation. You performed an invasive intervention without explicit physician authorization. And you created, he glanced at the papers in front of him, a disruptive and unsafe clinical environment. The patient's blood pressure stabilized, Emily said. He made it to the OR. That is not the issue. I think it's the central issue. Pryor opened her folder. Ms. Doss, Emily, or Nurse Doss? We've also reviewed a pattern of similar conduct over the past several months. Pryor's voice had the practiced neutrality of someone delivering weather. Documented instances of contradicting physician orders in front of patients. Unauthorized modification of supply setups. A complaint from Dr. Voss in September. Emily hadn't known about the September complaint. Her face did not change. Dr. Voss, she said, told me to step back from a patient who was 40 seconds from cardiac arrest. That is Dr. Voss's account as well, Steck said. He reports that you disregarded his assessment and intervened without authorization. His assessment, she said carefully, was wrong. The silence in the room had a particular texture. Steck looked at Pryor. Pryor looked at her folder. The hospital has a responsibility, Steck said, to maintain clear lines of clinical authority. When those lines are disrupted, a man almost died. When those lines are disrupted, regardless of outcome, the hospital's protocols are compromised. He folded his hands on the table. We've made a decision, and I want to be clear that it reflects a pattern of behavior, not a single incident. Emily was quiet. She was thinking about Marcus Webb's eyes, going dim at 10:02 in the morning. She was thinking about a tourniquet applied in the dark, in a different country, with less equipment than she'd had today. She was thinking about how the room had gone quiet when she moved, and how that quiet had not been the quiet of people who thought she was wrong. Effective immediately, Pryor said. Your employment with Sutter Ridge Medical Center is terminated. You'll be escorted to collect your personal items. Your access credentials will be deactivated at the end of this meeting. Emily looked at the three of them. She said nothing for a moment. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she was choosing. She was always choosing. Was the surgery successful? Steck blinked. I beg your pardon? Marcus Webb, the patient from Trauma Bay 1. Did he make it out of the OR? Pryor and Steck exchanged a glance. That information is, I'll take that as a yes, Emily said. She stood. She didn't extend a hand because no one had offered theirs. She turned and she walked to the door and she paused with her hand on the frame. I've worked trauma medicine for 14 years, she said. Not loudly, just clearly. In places that would dismantle everything you think you know about crisis response. I've never lost a patient I could have saved. She looked back at Voss specifically. Make sure you can say the same. She left the door open behind her. The security guard who walked her to the locker room was a young man named Pete, who she'd talked to maybe 6 times over 3 years. He didn't speak during the escort, but when she had her bag and her jacket and her bus pass, he held the stairwell door for her. He made it out of the OR, Pete said quietly. Heard it on the radio. She stopped. She let that land. Thank you, she said. She walked down 4 flights of stairs and through the main lobby and out into the November air in Denton, Montana, where it was 34 degrees and the sky was the color of old concrete. She stood on the sidewalk with her bag over one shoulder. Behind her, the glass doors of Sutter Ridge Medical Center slid shut. Somewhere up on the 4th floor, Raymond Steck was probably already back on his phone. Voss was probably already back in his element. Rounds, orders, the pleasant authority of being the most important person in any given room. Emily stood on the sidewalk for exactly 40 seconds. Then she started walking toward the bus stop. She didn't hear the vehicles at first. The sound registered as ambient, traffic, the rumble of something large on the street behind her. She was already 40 feet from the entrance when she heard the tires. Not one vehicle, several. She turned. 3 black SUVs had pulled into the hospital's main entrance in tight formation. No lights, no sirens. But the way they moved, the spacing, the deliberate precision, the way the lead vehicle swung wide to control the approach angle, That wasn't civilian driving. She knew that driving. She had ridden in that driving, in a different life. The vehicle stopped at the main entrance and the doors opened. And the men who stepped out were not the kind of men you see in hospital parking lots on a Tuesday morning in November in Montana. Emily stood on the sidewalk. She watched them go through the glass doors. She did not move for a long time. She counted 4 men through the glass doors before the angle cut off her sightline, and then she stood there on the cold sidewalk doing something she almost never did anymore. She hesitated. The bus would come in 11 minutes. She knew the schedule the way she knew medication dosages, without having to think about it, just there, banked in some functional corner of her memory. 11 minutes. She could be on it. She could be gone, and whatever was happening inside Sutter Ridge right now would be someone else's situation. She had a bag on her shoulder and no job in 34 degrees of Montana November, pressing in from all sides. She had exactly no obligation to anyone inside that building. She turned back toward the entrance. Not because she was certain, not because she had a plan. She turned back because the vehicles were still running. She could see the exhaust. And men who arrived in tight formation and left their engines running were not men who expected to stay long. Which meant whatever they'd come for, they already knew where it was. The lobby guard. Not Pete, a different one. A heavy-set man named Gerald, who had once spent 10 minutes telling Emily about his brother-in-law's deck renovation, was standing behind the reception desk with the specific posture of someone who had just been told something they weren't sure how to process. He looked at Emily when she came back through the doors, and his expression flickered into something between recognition and relief. "Ms. Doss? Who are they?" she asked. "Military," Gerald said, with the gravity of a man for whom that word had always existed at a comfortable distance. "Said they're here about a patient." He lowered his voice. "They went straight to 4. 4. The executive floor." Emily shifted her bag. She went to the waiting area near the main desk, a cluster of chairs against the wall, the kind of place where nobody looks twice at someone sitting. And she sat. She was not invited. She was not asked to be there. She was a terminated employee who had, technically, been escorted out of the building 22 minutes ago. But Gerald didn't say anything, and the other lobby staff were too occupied watching the elevator numbers to pay her attention. So she sat with her bag on her lap, and she waited. It took 4 minutes before one of the men came back down. Not one of the 4 she'd counted. A 5th, who must have come in a vehicle she hadn't tracked. He was younger than the others. Mid-20s, she guessed. Close-cropped hair. The particular physical economy of someone who'd been conditioned not to waste movement. He crossed the lobby without hesitation and came directly to where Emily was sitting. She hadn't moved. She hadn't looked like she was waiting for anything, but he came directly to her. "You're Doss," he said. Not a question. "I was, until about 40 minutes ago." He crouched to her eye level, which was not what she expected. His voice dropped. "Sergeant Major Webb is in recovery. He's stable. The surgical team says the tourniquet application is the reason he got to the OR with viable blood pressure." He paused. "My name's Reyes. I'm his team medic." Emily looked at him carefully. "You drove 4 SUVs to a hospital in Montana to check on one patient." "We drove 4 SUVs to a hospital in Montana," Reyes said, "because Marcus Webb told us from his recovery bed that the nurse who saved him had been fired before he was fully out of anesthesia." A beat. He was pretty clear about it. Emily said nothing. "He asked us to find you," Reyes said. "We did. I'm sitting in the lobby." "Yeah." He almost smiled. "That made it easier." She looked toward the elevators. "What's happening upstairs?" "Commander Alt is talking to your hospital director." He said it the way you say something that sounds simple but isn't. "He's explaining the situation." "What situation is that?" Reyes looked at her steadily. "The situation where a decorated combat medic with 14 years of service saves a Navy SEAL's life and gets fired for it inside of 2 hours." He stood. "Commander Alt has opinions about that situation." She stood too, because sitting felt wrong now. "I don't need anyone to fight my—" "I know," Reyes said. "That's not what this is." He pulled a card from his jacket and held it out. "But we'd like you to stay available. Whatever happens up there, it's going to go faster if you're in the building." She took the card. She looked at it. It had a number and nothing else. "I'll be here," she said. He nodded once and crossed back to the elevators. Emily sat back down. Gerald at the front desk was watching her with something approaching awe. "You know those guys?" he asked. "Not really," she said, which was true, but she knew their type, had been adjacent to it for long enough to recognize the particular frequency they operated on. The absence of wasted energy, the way they scanned a room not from fear but from habit. She had worked alongside men and women built the same way once, before Sutter Ridge, before Denton, before the version of her life that had decided 3 years ago that quiet was sustainable. Upstairs on the 4th floor, something was happening that she could not see. She could construct it from what she knew. Raymond Steck in his conference room, the same one where he'd terminated her 40 minutes ago, facing a man named Commander Alt, who had driven here from wherever Marcus Webb's team had been staged. Steck would have started with protocol, visitor authorization, proper channels, the comfortable maze of institutional process that kept uncomfortable things at a distance. He would have deployed his practiced version of calm. She suspected Commander Alt had not been interested in that. She was right, though she wouldn't know the details until later. What happened upstairs was this. Commander Alt entered Raymond Steck's office with 2 men at his shoulders and a tablet in his hand, and he did not sit, and he did not accept the coffee Steck's assistant offered, and he said, with the directness of someone who had learned long ago that preamble was a form of dishonesty, "I want to understand why the nurse who kept my operator alive was removed from this building before his surgery was complete." Steck had deployed his calm. He'd explained incident report, clinical authority, pattern of behavior. He'd used words like protocol and chain of command, which were words that he suspected would resonate with military men. They had not resonated. "I've reviewed the paramedic report," Alt had said. Her tourniquet application was textbook TCCC, high and tight, correct placement for suspected proximal femoral involvement, time marked. He'd set the tablet on Steck's desk. The attending physician had not yet initiated hemorrhage control at the time she intervened. My man had been in that room for over 90 seconds. The physician was assessing 90 seconds, Alt said again, with a femoral bleed and a pressure in the 50s. Steck had looked at Voss, who was in the room because Steck had wanted him there as support. Voss was no longer providing the support Steck had anticipated. Dr. Voss was managing a complex. "I'd like to see the incident report," Alt said. "The one filed this morning." There was a pause. "That's an internal document. I have a JAG officer in the second vehicle," Alt said. "She's patient, but she's also very good at requesting things through channels that move faster than you'd like." He looked at Steck without heat, without theater, just looked at him. "Or you can show me the report." The report was produced. Alt read it. He read it without expression, which was more unsettling than if he'd reacted. Then he set it down and said, "This report states that Nurse Doss intervened without physician authorization and created an unsafe clinical environment. It does not mention that the patient's blood pressure was 58 over palpation on arrival. It does not mention that she had staged hemorrhage control equipment prior to the patient's arrival. It does not mention that the attending physician had given a direct instruction to step back." He looked up. "It also doesn't mention the outcome." Steck said, "Outcomes don't—" "My operator is alive," Alt said. "That is an outcome." Down in the lobby, Emily didn't know the exact texture of what was happening, but she felt the building shift, not literally, but the way institutions shift when something outside their control arrives. The front desk staff were quieter than usual. 2 of the nurses who came through the lobby on their way to lunch made eye contact with her and then looked away, which meant the story was already moving through the department. Stories moved fast in hospitals. They moved faster than medication orders and almost as fast as bad news. Torres came through at 12:15. He stopped when he saw her. "You're still here," he said. "Apparently." He sat down next to her. He was still in scrubs, hadn't had a break yet, and he had the wired, careful look of someone running on stress and adrenaline. "The military guys are still upstairs," he said. "The whole 4th floor is basically in lockdown. Steck's assistant sent out a message that his afternoon meetings are canceled." "All of them?" "All of them." Torres looked at his hands. "They're asking about the incident report, and they're asking about the body camera footage from the trauma bay." Emily turned to look at him. "The trauma bay has body cameras?" "Since September. Steck pushed it through after the liability review." Torres met her eyes. Everything that happened in there this morning, it's on record. She sat with that for a moment. Voss knew, she said. It wasn't a question. She was simply arranging the pieces in order. Voss had known about the cameras, had been at Sutter Ridge when they were installed, had probably thought of them as protection for the physicians, documentation that the team had followed procedure. He would not have considered, when he texted Steck during the resuscitation, that the footage would become evidence against him. People rarely considered the thing that undid them. Torres said, "There's something else." He kept his voice low. "The night resident, Faber, you know him?" "Barely. He came to me this morning, after the meeting. He said Voss told him to update his documentation on the Webb case, add language about the tourniquet being premature, about the intervention being unsanctioned." Emily looked at him. "He told Voss no," Torres said. "First time I've ever heard of Faber telling anyone no." A pause. "He's talking to the military investigators right now. He went up about 20 minutes ago." The afternoon moved the way afternoons move inside storms. Time behaving strangely, fast in some moments and viscous in others. Emily stayed in the lobby because she'd said she would, and because there was nowhere else that made sense. She bought a cup of coffee from the cart near the main desk, which tasted like hot compromise, and she drank it standing up because she was tired of sitting. At 2:34, Diane Pryor came through the lobby. She did not look like the woman who had read from a folder that morning with the calm precision of someone delivering weather. She looked like someone who had been in a room she wanted to leave for a long time and had only just been allowed to. She walked quickly, her folder pressed against her chest, her eyes fixed on the exterior doors. She didn't look at Emily. Emily watched her go. At 3:10, the elevators opened and Raymond Steck walked out with the particular posture of a man who has lost an argument he didn't expect to lose. He was followed by a woman Emily didn't recognize, 40s, civilian clothes, the JAG officer Alt had mentioned, and behind them, Dr. Voss. Voss looked like something had been removed from him, not dramatically. He wasn't in pieces, he was just smaller somehow. The architecture of his certainty had shifted, and without it, his face was just a face. He saw Emily. She didn't move, she didn't speak. She just looked at him the way she'd looked at patients in recovery. Cataloging, taking inventory, noting what was there and what wasn't. He looked away first. The three of them went to a room off the main corridor. The door closed. Reyes appeared at Emily's elbow. "Commander Alt wants to speak with you," he said. "Fourth floor." She picked up her bag. The elevator ride was unremarkable. The fourth floor looked the same as it always had. Beige carpet, framed mission statements, the ambient hum of administration. But the conference room where she'd been terminated 4 hours ago had been rearranged. The table had paper on it. There were two men she didn't know seated at the far end, and a woman with a laptop who was taking notes without looking up. Commander Alt was standing at the window. He was not what she'd built in her imagination during the lobby hours. She'd constructed someone large and deliberate, and he was those things, but also quieter than she expected. Maybe 50, maybe younger, with the kind of face that had decided long ago that it wasn't going to give much away. He turned when she came in. "Emily Doss," he said. "Yes. I'm Commander Daniel Alt. I'm Marcus Webb's commanding officer." He didn't move from the window. "I'm told you served as a combat medic with the 75th Ranger Regiment for 8 years before your transition to civilian practice." "That's right." "And that your deployment record includes 2 tours in active combat zones, a commendation for medical performance under fire, and a field promotion." He paused. "That's not in your Sutter Ridge personnel file, by the way." "I didn't put it there." He studied her. "Why not?" She considered the question honestly, because he seemed like a man who would notice if she didn't. "Because I didn't want it to be the thing people saw when they looked at me. I wanted to work on my own terms, not on the terms of what I used to be." He nodded slowly. "How'd that work out?" She looked around the room. The conference table, the mission statement on the wall, the window beyond which you could see the edge of the hospital parking lot, and if you looked further, the road she'd been walking toward 4 hours ago. "Not great," she said. Something shifted in his expression that might, in another man, have been the beginning of a smile. "Sit down, Ms. Doss." She sat. What followed was not a deposition and not an interview and not anything with a precise name. It was a conversation in which Commander Alt asked questions and Emily answered them directly, and the woman with the laptop wrote things down, and the two men at the far end of the table occasionally glanced at each other in ways she couldn't fully read. She told him about the preparation before Webb's arrival, the tourniquet, the staging, what she'd noticed about the supply setup. She told him about Voss's instruction to step back. She told him what she'd seen in Marcus Webb's eyes at 10:02 in the morning, and what that particular dimming meant to someone who had seen it before. She did not editorialize. She did not ask for credit. When she finished, Alt was quiet for a moment. "The body camera footage," he said. "We've reviewed it. Torres told me about the cameras. What you did in that bay is what we teach special operations medics to do in the field when there's no surgeon available and a patient is 30 seconds from arrest." He looked at her directly. "You didn't do too much. You did exactly enough." She didn't answer because the sentence didn't require an answer. It was just the truth, and the truth didn't need her to confirm it. "The incident report filed against you this morning contains documented inaccuracies," Alt said. "It omits material facts about the patient's clinical status at the time of your intervention. It misrepresents the sequence of events in Trauma Bay 1. He paused. "We believe those inaccuracies were deliberate." "I'm not surprised," Emily said. "Neither am I." He set his hands on the table. "Here's where we are. The hospital has been informed that we're requesting a formal review of the incident documentation, the body camera footage, and any communications between hospital administrators that reference the Webb case. That review will be conducted by military medical investigators in coordination with the state medical board." She absorbed that. "That's going to take time." "It's going to take some time, yes. And in the meantime, Alt said, "you are not required to be anywhere you don't want to be." He met her eyes. "But I'd like to ask you to stay in Denton." "I live in Denton." "Good." He stood, which she recognized as the signal that the meeting was concluding. "Ms. Doss, what you did for Marcus Webb this morning, I want you to know that his team is aware of it, all of it." She stood. She picked up her bag. "How is he?" she asked. "Actually, not the clinical summary." Alt considered that. "He asked if you knew what you were doing before you applied the tourniquet, or if you were improvising." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd ask you." She looked at the window for a moment. Outside, the sky had the low, dense quality of late November in Montana, the kind of sky that was deciding whether to snow. "I wasn't improvising," she said. "I've done that exact application 11 times in the field." He was number 12. She left the 4th floor conference room. She took the elevator down. She crossed the lobby where Gerald watched her with an expression she didn't have the energy to interpret, and she went through the glass doors into the cold. The black SUVs were still in the lot. One of them had its passenger door open, and Reyes was sitting in the opening, eating something from a wrapper, watching the parking lot with the patient attention of someone who had waited in worse places. He saw her and lifted his chin in acknowledgement. She kept walking, past the SUVs, toward the sidewalk, toward the bus stop at the corner. She had no reason to stay in the lot, and standing around waiting for something to resolve had never been her instinct. Resolution came from movement, not from standing still. She was almost to the sidewalk when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She stopped and answered. Silence for a second. Then a voice she didn't recognize. Older, male, with the flat cadence of a man who chose words the way other people chose tools. For a specific function, nothing decorative. "Ms. Doss, my name is Colonel Alistair Drum. I'm the director of the Army Medical Investigation Unit. I've been briefed on the events at Sutter Ridge today." A pause. "I've also been briefed on something else. Something that my team flagged this afternoon, about 40 minutes ago." She stood at the edge of the parking lot with the cold coming in off the street. "What's that?" she asked. "The incident report filed against you this morning," Drum said. "The one with the inaccurate documentation. We pulled the file metadata." Another pause, deliberately waited. "It was modified twice, once at 10:54 this morning and once at 12:07 this afternoon. The second modification was made from a terminal in the hospital director's office." Emily didn't say anything. "Ms. Doss," Drum said, "Raymond Steck is currently in his office. He doesn't know we have this yet." A beat. "I think you should be in the building when he finds out." She turned around. Not because Drum had told her to. Not because she owed Sutter Ridge anything. She didn't, not anymore, maybe not for a long time before today either. She turned around because the thing that had kept her functional across 14 years of medicine, across 2 combat deployments, and 31 months of being the nurse nobody fully looked at, was a specific and unglamorous instinct. Finish what you started. She walked back through the glass doors. Gerald looked up from the desk and opened his mouth. "I know," she said. "I'm not supposed to be here." "I wasn't going to say that," he said. She stopped. "What were you going to say?" He looked at her for a moment, then at his desk, then back at her. "Fourth floor's been loud for the last hour. I can hear it from the elevator bank." He paused. "I've worked here 11 years. It's never been loud up there." She took the elevator. The 4th floor was not technically loud, but it had the contained energy of a space where loud things had recently happened and might happen again. The beige carpet and the framed mission statements were the same, but 2 of the men she'd seen earlier were now positioned in the corridor outside the main conference room, and the door to Raymond Steck's office, which she'd never been inside before, had only passed in the hall, was closed. She went to the conference room. The woman with the laptop was still there. The 2 men at the table had been replaced by 1 man she didn't recognize, plus Colonel Drum, who was on the phone when she entered, and who lifted 2 fingers in the universal signal for "give me a moment" without looking up. He was older than she'd constructed from his voice. Mid-50s, lean in the way people are lean when they've been lean a long time, with a posture that didn't announce itself but was simply there. He wore civilian clothes, a dark jacket, no visible rank, but he had the economy of motion that military medicine produced in people after enough years. He finished his call. "Ms. Doss," he said. "Faster than I expected. I was in the parking lot." "Good." He put his phone face down on the table, which she noted. People who put their phones face down in meetings were either being respectful or ensuring they couldn't see incoming information. She suspected it was the latter. "Sit down. I want to walk you through what we have." She sat. What Colonel Drum laid out over the next 12 minutes was not a narrative. It was a sequence of documented facts, presented in the order in which they became legally relevant, and it was more extensive than Emily had expected, which meant investigators had been moving faster than the hospital administration realized. The incident report had been filed at 10:31 a.m. by Dr. Harlan Voss. The original version, recovered from the system's automatic backup archive, described the intervention in clinical language that was pointed but not materially false. It noted unauthorized tourniquet application. It noted Emily's failure to comply with physician instruction. It did not describe Marcus Webb's blood pressure on arrival. It did not note the time elapse between patient arrival and physician hemorrhage control initiation. At 10:54 a.m., 7 minutes after Emily had been notified of her termination, the report was accessed and modified from Voss's own terminal. 2 additions. Language characterizing the tourniquet placement as potentially damaging to vascular repair options, and a statement that the patient's hemodynamic status did not, in the attending physician's clinical assessment, yet warrant the level of intervention applied. She read that line twice. "He wrote that," she said. "Voss wrote that the patient didn't yet warrant intervention." At 10:54, Drum said, 47 minutes after Marcus Webb left Trauma Bay 1 with a blood pressure of 84/50, which is itself a significant improvement over his arrival numbers. She set the paper down. And the second modification? 12:07 p.m. from a terminal registered to Raymond Steck's office login credentials. Drum slid a second page across the table. This one added a paragraph to the summary section characterizing your overall conduct in the department as representing a pattern of clinical insubordination that had been escalating toward a significant patient safety incident. Emily looked at the paragraph. It was well written, which was almost impressive under the circumstances. Steck, or someone working with him, had chosen language that sounded procedural, the kind of language that appeared in risk management documents and joint commission reports, and personnel files that were later used in wrongful termination defenses. "He was building the file," she said. "He was building the file," Drum confirmed, "retroactively, while you were still in the building being escorted out." He leaned back slightly. "The problem is that the system's backup protocol runs every 22 minutes, and the 1031 version was captured in the 1044 backup. The 1054 version was captured at 1106. The metadata is clean and unambiguous." She was quiet for a moment. "Who else knows about this?" "Commander Alt. My two investigators. He paused. And now you. Steck doesn't know you have the metadata. Not yet. She looked at the closed door across the corridor. What happens when he finds out? That, Drum said, depends somewhat on what he does in the next few minutes. He picked up his phone from the table. We're going to walk into his office now and show him what we have. I'd like you present for that conversation. Why? He considered the question with what seemed like genuine attention. Because you're the one he decided to make the problem. And because I've found in 23 years of medical investigation that the people who alter documents are significantly more honest when the person they tried to bury is in the room. She thought about that. That's not standard procedure, she said. No, he agreed. It's not. She stood. Okay. Drum's knock on Steck's office door was 2 beats. Not loud, not tentative. The kind of knock that expects to be answered. A voice from inside said, "Not now," and Drum opened the door anyway. Raymond Steck was at his desk. He was on the phone, and he looked up with the expression of a man who had been managing a crisis for 6 hours and had developed a very short tolerance for additional input. Then he registered Drum, and then he registered Emily behind Drum, and his face did something complicated and not entirely controlled. He said something into the phone and ended the call. "This is my office," he said. "I know," Drum said. He came in and set 2 printed pages on Steck's desk. "I need you to look at these." Steck looked at them the way people look at things they already know are bad. His eyes moved down the first page quickly, too quickly, which meant he understood what he was seeing without needing to read carefully, which meant he knew exactly what the document was. "The metadata," he said. "Yes." The word hung there. Steck set the page down. He had good posture. He'd always had good posture, the kind that came from years of sitting in rooms where posture was legible as authority. Even now, it held. But his hands, which he placed flat on the desk, were applying pressure to the surface in a way that was not relaxed. "I'd like to have legal counsel present before—" "That's your right," Drum said, "but I want you to understand what we're looking at before you make decisions about how to proceed." He remained standing. The incident report filed in Marcus Webb's case was modified twice after its initial submission. The second modification was made from your login credentials at 12:07 p.m. today. That modification added material that was not factually accurate and that directly affected the clinical and legal characterization of Emily Doss's intervention. Steck was looking at the page again. Login credentials can be accessed by your office door was logged as secured at 11:58 a.m., Drum said. Badge access shows 1 entry. Yours, no exits until 12:34 p.m. He paused. Your assistant has already confirmed she was at lunch from 11:45 to 12:20. The room was very still. Emily had positioned herself slightly behind and to the left of Drum, which was not theater. It was simply where she'd ended up, and she recognized that it was the correct position for what she was doing, which was witnessing. She'd testified before. She'd given sworn statements in field conditions and in offices considerably more intimidating than this one. She knew how to be in a room without becoming the room's center of gravity. She watched Steck. She watched the moment when a man who had spent his career building the architecture of institutional authority understood that the architecture had a load-bearing wall he hadn't accounted for. He sat back. "I want you to understand," Steck said, and his voice was different now. Quieter, stripped of its administrative register, just a man's voice. That this hospital has operated under significant financial and regulatory pressure. Dr. Voss is our leading trauma physician. Any action that— "Mr. Steck," Drum said, not unkindly. "I'm not here to discuss the hospital's operational context. What are you here for?" "I'm here because a member of the United States military was treated at this facility and because the nurse whose intervention preserved his life was terminated and her clinical record falsified within 2 hours of that intervention." Drum's voice hadn't changed in pitch or pace the entire conversation. "That creates a federal interest in what happened here today." Steck looked at Emily for the first time since she'd entered the room. She didn't look away. "I made a decision," Steck said. "Not to Drum. To her. Based on the information I had. Voss filed that report and I—" "You modified it," she said. "That's not the same as relying on it." He looked at the desk. "I was protecting the hospital." You were protecting Voss, she said, and yourself. She paused. Marcus Webb was still in surgery when you did it. That landed. She watched it land. Steck said nothing. Drum collected his papers. My investigators will need access to your records management system and to Dr. Voss's communication logs from this morning. A formal request will come through the hospital's legal department within the hour. He looked at Steck. I'd recommend you contact your personal legal counsel, not the hospital's. They left the office. Drum closed the door behind them. In the corridor, the two investigators were waiting. Drum exchanged a look with the taller one. Something passed between them that Emily couldn't read and didn't need to. And then he turned to her. That went about how I expected, he said. Did it? He didn't deny it. Drum said it like a professional notation, a fact cataloged without judgment. That matters. She followed him back toward the conference room, and the late afternoon light was coming through the corridor windows at a low angle, the kind of November light that made everything look like it was already in the past. She was tired. Not the acute tired of a long shift. She knew that tired, had learned to function inside it. This was the tired that came from a day that had required her to be more present than she'd planned for, in more rooms than she'd expected, performing a kind of alertness that cost something. She hadn't eaten since 5:30 in the morning. The conference room had acquired new occupants. A man she didn't recognize, 50s, dark suit, carrying the particular self-possession of someone accustomed to arriving into situations already in progress, was speaking quietly with Commander Alt near the window. Reyes was by the door, and he glanced at her when she entered with the same economical acknowledgement he'd used in the lobby what felt like several days ago. Alt crossed the room to her. How'd it go? He asked. He didn't deny accessing the file, she said. Drum said that matters. It matters a great deal. Alt looked at Drum, who nodded. Ms. Doss, I want to introduce you to someone. He gestured toward the man in the dark suit. This is Dr. Warren Foyle. He's the regional director for the State Medical Board's Professional Conduct Division. Foyle offered his hand. His grip was firm without announcement. Ms. Doss, I received a call from Colonel Drum's office this afternoon regarding the circumstances of your termination. I've reviewed the body camera footage from Trauma Bay 1. She waited. I'll need a formal statement from you, he said. Regarding the clinical sequence in the trauma bay, your intervention and the instructions you received from Dr. Voss before you applied the tourniquet. How formal, sworn and recorded. He said it without apology because there was nothing to apologize for. Given the documentation concerns that have emerged today, we want the record built correctly. When? Tomorrow morning would be ideal. We can do it here or at our regional office. Your choice. She thought about it. Here, she said, I want it in this building. Something shifted in Foyle's expression that might have been respect, though he was careful about it. Here it is, then. He produced a card, which she took. After he moved away, Alt remained. There's something else, he said. His voice had changed, not dramatically, but it had dropped the operational quality, the command frequency, and become something closer to personal. Marcus is awake. He's been awake for about an hour. He's been asking questions about you since before the anesthesia was fully out. So Reyes said, he wants to talk to you. A pause. When you're ready. No pressure. She thought about Marcus Webb at 10:02 in the morning, 200 pounds of trained operator with his blood pressure in the basement and his eyes going wrong. She thought about the tourniquet in her hands and the marker and Pete's voice in the stairwell telling her Webb had made it out of the OR. I'm ready now, she said. The recovery unit was 2 floors below. She went with Alt and Reyes and nobody else. And the unit nurse, a woman named Gail, who had been at Sutter Ridge longer than Emily and who looked at her with the expression of someone who had been following the day's events through the hospital's informal information network, showed them to the room without being asked twice. Marcus Webb was in the 3rd bed. He was bigger than he'd seemed in the trauma bay, which was counterintuitive. People usually seemed larger in crisis, when all the energy of a room was organized around them. But lying in a hospital bed with monitors and a drainage tube and his right leg immobilized, he was simply a very large person who had been through something serious and was working, visibly, against the pull of painkillers and surgical exhaustion to be present. He looked at her when she came in. You're shorter than I thought, he said. His voice was rough, medicated. "You were mostly horizontal," she said. That produced something around his eyes that was the effort of a man who wanted to smile and found that his face wasn't fully cooperating. He looked at Alt, then back at Emily. "They tell me you applied the tourniquet." "I did." "They tell me Voss told you to step back." "He did." He studied her. His eyes were clearer than she expected, the kind of eyes that had been trained to cut through medication and fatigue to remain functional. "Why didn't you?" She thought about giving him a clinical answer. She had one ready: the hemodynamic indicators, the elapsed time, the assessment she'd made in less than 3 seconds based on 14 years of specific experience with exactly this category of injury. Instead, she said, "Because I've seen what happens when you wait." He held her gaze for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." She stayed for 8 minutes. She didn't perform anything, didn't reassure him with optimism about his recovery, didn't construct a version of the morning that was cleaner than it had been. She answered his questions directly. Yes, the bleed was femoral adjacent, close enough that the OR team would have called it proximal. Yes, the tourniquet placement was standard TCCC protocol for that injury profile. Yes, the pressure on arrival was bad enough that 8 more minutes would have been a different conversation. He didn't thank her during those 8 minutes. She didn't expect him to. Gratitude, in her experience, took time to locate after the body had been through something that significant. What he did was look at her steadily and ask specific questions and listen to the answers with his full attention, which was its own form of respect, and one she understood better than most. When she stood to leave, he said, "Doss?" She turned. "Whatever they're doing upstairs about your job, I told Alt I want it fixed." He held her eyes. "I don't say that lightly." "I know," she said. "Thank you." She meant it, and he knew she meant it, and that was enough. Back on the 4th floor, the situation had metastasized in the 40 minutes she'd been with Marcus Webb. The conference room was fuller. 2 individuals she hadn't seen before were seated at the table with open laptops, and the documents spread across the surface had multiplied. Drum was on the phone again, the same face-down while not-in-use behavior reversed into active intensity. Reyes took up his usual post by the door and gave her the summary in 30 seconds. Voss had, in the past hour, attempted to access the incident report a 3rd time from a hallway terminal and been locked out. The lockout was automatic. The system had been flagged by Drum's team, and all access to the web file was now controlled. Voss had then gone to Steck's office, apparently unaware that Steck himself was by then on a call with a personal attorney. The conversation between them had been brief and, by all accounts, not productive. "Where's Voss now?" Emily asked. "His office," Reyes said. "He's been there for about 20 minutes. She thought about that. "He knows the metadata exists," she said, probably guessing at this point. He tried to access the file, got locked out, and Steck's not talking to him. Reyes shrugged slightly. "If I were him, I'd be on the phone with a lawyer." "Is he?" "We don't know yet." He looked at her. Drums requested a hold on all outgoing administrative communications from the hospital's physician network pending the investigation. Whether the IT department executes that quickly enough is... He stopped. "Actually, no. We don't know." She went to the window. The parking lot was dark now. It was past 5, and November dark came early and completely in Montana. The black SUVs were still there, visible under the lot lights. Somewhere between the parking lot and the lobby and the 4th floor and Marcus Webb's recovery room, the day had shifted from the kind of day that happened to her into the kind of day she was inside of, actively, without a clear exit. She was still thinking about Voss in his office with 20 minutes of quiet. 20 minutes was enough time to make decisions that couldn't be undone. She turned to Reyes. His computer, the one he used to file the original report and the first modification at 10:54. It's in his office? Reyes looked at her. "Should be." "Is there a hold on his system access?" Reyes picked up his phone and typed something. The response came back in about 12 seconds. He looked up at her. "No," he said. "The hold request only covered administrative accounts. Physician clinical accounts need a separate authorization." His voice had shifted into something tighter. "That authorization was filed 20 minutes ago." So for the past 20 minutes, his access was unrestricted. Reyes was already moving toward Drum. "Hey, But Drum was off his call, and the taller investigator was already typing, and the room had absorbed the information in the fast compression way that rooms full of trained people absorb problems. 2 minutes of rapid, quiet coordination followed, and then the investigator looked up from his laptop and said, "His system access has been revoked. 15 minutes too late." The room was quiet. "What did he do?" Emily asked. "He accessed the web file 3 minutes after his network lockout from the hallway terminal. He accessed it from his office." The investigator turned his screen slightly so Drum could see. He also sent 2 emails. To who? One to an external address we're running now. The investigator looked at Drum. One to Patricia Marlowe, the head of trauma surgery. The one person in the physician hierarchy who had, as far as Emily could tell, not been actively complicit in the morning's events. The one who had said 2 weeks ago in a staffing meeting that Emily flagging a pressure drop wasn't liability. That was nursing. Emily said, "What did the email to Marlowe say?" "We don't have it yet. Her account is within the physician network." The investigator looked at Drum. "We'll need to request it through..." The door opened. Not Drum's people, not Alt or Reyes or the JAG officer or anyone from the 4th floor's newly assembled population of investigators. It was Patricia Marlowe, in scrubs, still wearing her surgical cap pushed back on her head, with a phone in her hand and the expression of someone who had read something in the last 10 minutes that had rearranged her understanding of the day. She looked around the room. Her eyes landed on Emily. "I got an email from Harlan," she said, "about 15 minutes ago." Drum said, "We'd like to see it." "I know." She looked at her phone, then at Drum. "He's asking me to corroborate his account of the trauma bay. He's saying the intervention was dangerous. He's saying..." She stopped. She pressed her lips together. "He's asking me to say that the tourniquet placement risked vascular damage and that his instruction to step back was clinically justified." The room absorbed that. "What are you going to tell him?" Emily asked. Marlowe looked at her. She was a careful woman. Emily had always read her as someone who operated from calibrated positions, who didn't extend herself beyond what she could defend. She was the kind of physician who would have made a reasonable administrator, if she'd wanted that, because she understood the intersection of medicine and institution in a way that most people in her position didn't bother to. She looked at the phone. She looked at Emily. "I reviewed that tourniquet placement in the OR," Marlowe said, "before we opened the wound. It was correct. High, tight, properly torqued, correctly marked with time of application." She paused. "There was no vascular compromise attributable to the tourniquet. The injury to the femoral structure was pre-existing trauma." She put her phone face down on the conference table, the same gesture Drum had used, Emily noted, and wondered what it meant when 2 very different people shared a tell. "I'm not going to tell him anything different. We'll need that in our formal statement," Drum said. "I know." She pulled out a chair and sat. "Tell me what you need." What followed was an hour of focused, unglamorous work. Marlowe giving a recorded statement to one of Drum's investigators, while the others continued pulling file access logs and communication records. Emily sat at the far end of the table drinking bad coffee and answering questions when she was asked them and staying quiet otherwise. She'd learned in places with worse lighting than this that being useful in a room didn't always mean being active. Sometimes it meant staying present and not contaminating the process. At 6:48 p.m., the door opened again. This time it was the younger of Drum's 2 investigators, who had been working in the corridor for the past 30 minutes, and his face had the contained expression of someone carrying information that was about to change the shape of the room. "We got the external email," he said. Drum looked at him. "Voss emailed a medical malpractice attorney at 5:23 p.m., the investigator said. "We flagged the address when it came up in the request logs. The attorney's office is in Billings." He set a printed page on the table. The email outlines a proposed claim strategy. He's arguing preemptive self-defense, that Emily Doss's intervention constituted unauthorized medical practice that created liability exposure for the hospital, and that his documented objection in the incident report demonstrates he attempted to prevent harm. Nobody spoke for a moment. "He's building a countercase," Alt said, "while we're in this building." "He sent it 90 minutes after the file access," the investigator confirmed. Emily looked at the printed email. She didn't read it. She didn't need to, and looking at it would serve no function except to confirm that a man she had worked beside for 31 months had, on the day she saved a patient's life, decided that his primary goal was to convert her actions into his legal protection. She put the page back down. She was about to say something when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Not the one Colonel Drum had called from. A different unknown. She answered it. 3 seconds of silence. Then a voice she knew. Not well, but unmistakably. Diane Pryor, from Human Resources, who had read from a folder that morning with the practiced calm of someone who had done this many times before, who had not looked at Emily when she left the lobby, who had walked through the main doors at 2:34 p.m. with the expression of someone who had been somewhere difficult. Ms. Doss, Pryor said. Her voice was different from this morning, not the weather report neutrality, something underneath it, pressured and uncertain. I need to tell you something, not as HR, personally. She paused. I saw the original incident report before the 1054 modification. I saw it because Voss sent it to me directly before filing it through the system. He wanted my sign-off on the termination language. Emily was very still. The report he sent me, Pryor said, didn't have the language about vascular risk. It didn't say the patient's status didn't warrant intervention. Another pause. Longer. I signed off on the termination. I shouldn't have, but I did. And then the report changed and She stopped. I still have the version he sent me, the original, on my work email. Emily looked at Drum across the table. He was already looking at her. Ms. Pryor, Emily said carefully, I think you need to tell that to Colonel Drum. She held the phone out across the table. Drum took it. And across town, in an office on the 3rd floor of Sutter Ridge Medical Center, Dr. Harlan Voss was alone with a computer that could no longer access the file he needed, an attorney who had read his email and not yet responded, and a document, the original unmodified version of his own incident report, that existed on a server he couldn't reach and in an inbox he had forgotten to account for. Drum listened to Pryor for 40 seconds without interrupting. Emily watched him. She'd worked with enough people under pressure to read the quality of someone's attention. And Drum's was the kind that processed while it received, not waiting for the other person to finish so he could respond, but actually filing, sorting, building the structure of what he was hearing in real time. When Pryor stopped talking, he asked 2 questions. They were short, specific, and not the questions Emily would have predicted, which meant he was already 3 steps ahead of where she'd mapped the conversation. He ended the call and set her phone on the table between them. She has the email, he said. Time-stamped 10:17 a.m., before the first modification. He looked at his investigator. I need a forensic preservation request to Sutter Ridge's IT department in the next 10 minutes. Her work account, the sent folder from Voss's account for this morning, and any related thread. The investigator was already typing. Drum looked at Emily. Pryor signed the termination paperwork. I know, Emily said. She told me. She's going to have professional exposure from this. She knows that. She called anyway. Emily looked at the phone on the table between them. That took something. Drum considered that without sentimentality because sentimentality wasn't his register. But he didn't dismiss it either. He said, it did, and moved on. Because there was still a great deal to move through and the building's administrative day was ending, which meant access windows were closing and people were making decisions about what to take home with them, metaphorically and otherwise. The next 90 minutes operated on a frequency Emily had experienced before in different contexts. The sustained concentration of a situation that had passed its most acute phase but hadn't resolved, where the danger was no longer the emergency itself, but the paperwork, the procedure, the documented chain of custody that would determine what happened in the months to come. She'd had nights in the field like this, the threat addressed, the patient stabilized, and then the careful reconstruction of everything that had occurred because what happened next depended entirely on what the record showed. She stayed in the conference room and gave her sworn statement to Warren Foyle from the medical board. It took 40 minutes and covered everything from her pre-arrival staging to the moment she left Marcus Webb's side when Marlowe's team took over. She answered precisely and did not shade any answer in her own favor, including the part where she acknowledged that she had not verbally informed Voss she was proceeding despite his instruction. She had simply proceeded. Foyle noted this without expression. It was the kind of detail that could be used against her in a different framing of the day's events. And she named it herself because the record built on gaps was worse than the record built on uncomfortable facts. When it was over, Foyle said, "Thank you. I'll have a transcript to you within 48 hours for signature." She nodded. She went to the corridor. Torres was there. She hadn't known he was on the floor, hadn't seen him come in. Standing near the elevator with his hands in his scrub pockets, looking like a man who had made a decision and was living in the 30 seconds before he enacted it. He saw her. "I already talked to them," he said, meaning Drum's investigators. "An hour ago. I told them what Faber told me, and I told them what I saw in the trauma bay." He paused. "I also told them about September." She stopped. "What happened in September?" He looked at the floor, then at her. "Voss filed a complaint against you in September. You know about that part. But what you don't know is that I was interviewed for it. He asked me to confirm that you had, quote, demonstrated a pattern of undermining physician authority during patient care. Those were his exact words. He wrote them on the form and then asked me to confirm them." She waited. "I said I'd observed you contradicting physician judgment on 2 occasions, which was technically true." He met her eyes. "I didn't say whether you were right both times, which you were." He exhaled. "I've been thinking about that since this morning. I told the investigator the part I left out." She looked at him for a moment. He was young, 28, maybe 29, and he'd been navigating the same institutional architecture she had, except with less experience and without a combat deployment's worth of practice at understanding which rules existed to protect people and which existed to protect systems. "You told the truth today," she said. "That's what matters." "It's not enough." "It's not nothing," she said. "You made a harder call than you think you did." He looked at the elevator. "Is it going to be okay? For you?" She thought about the honest answer, which was that she didn't know yet, and the incomplete answer, which was probably, and the answer she actually gave him, which was, "Go home, Torres. You've been here since before 6. He almost smiled. He went to the elevator. At 8:20 p.m., the situation changed shape again. Drum came out of the conference room and found her in the corridor and said, without preamble, "Voss called Marlowe at 7:55. She recorded it." Emily looked at him. She called him back after she gave her statement. Her own decision. We didn't ask her to. He had a quality in his voice she hadn't heard from him before, something that wasn't quite surprise but was adjacent to it. She told him she'd received his email and wanted to discuss it. He spent 11 minutes explaining his position. He told her the tourniquet was clinically premature. He told her his incident report reflected his honest assessment. He told her, and this is the part, that if Marlowe corroborated his account, the liability exposure from the Webb case could be contained to a nursing error and the hospital could potentially avoid state board involvement. The corridor was quiet. He asked her to lie, Emily said. He laid out the functional argument for her to lie, yes, without using the word. Drum's expression was the expression of a man who had seen this particular species of behavior many times and had not grown accustomed to it. Marlowe's attorney is with us now. She's turning the recording over as evidence. Emily leaned against the wall. Not because she was dramatically affected. She wasn't. Not in the way that would have looked good in a different kind of story. She was tired, and her feet hurt, and she had been in this building for over 11 hours on a day she hadn't expected to be here at all. What she felt was not vindication, which was always described as something clean and clear. What she felt was the blunt weight of confirmation, the knowledge that what she'd understood since 11:40 a.m., standing without a chair in Steck's conference room, had turned out to be exactly as true as she'd thought. "What happens to him now?" she asked. "Formally? The State Medical Board receives our full investigation file within 5 business days. They have statutory authority to initiate a conduct review, suspend or revoke clinical privileges pending that review, and refer to the county DA if criminal falsification is supported by the evidence." Drum said it the way he said everything, with the flat precision of someone who'd been trained to let facts carry their own weight. Informally? His malpractice email went to an attorney who, when contacted by our JAG officer 20 minutes ago, immediately declined the engagement. The attorney doesn't want the case. The attorney read the email, reviewed a summary of the evidence we provided through official channels, and decided she had better clients. Emily absorbed that. And Steck? He's been in contact with personal counsel since 3 p.m. He hasn't communicated with Voss since before 5. That gap is going to be interesting in the administrative review. Drum looked at his watch. The hospital board's emergency session is tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. They've been notified of the investigation through the board chair. Who's the board chair? Woman named Dolores Achebe. She's been chair for 4 years. From what I understand, she and Steck have a functional but not close relationship. He looked at Emily. She's the one who convened the emergency session. Steck didn't call it. That was information. She filed it. She went home that night at 9:15, which was the first time she'd been outside the building since she turned around in the parking lot. The bus wasn't running. Reyes drove her in one of the black SUVs, which felt surreal in the specific way that things feel surreal when you've been operating in a high-intensity environment for too long and the ordinary world suddenly has different dimensions than you left it with. He didn't talk much during the drive, which she appreciated. When he pulled up to her building, a 3-story apartment complex on Denton's east side, practical and unremarkable, which was how she'd wanted it, he said, 7 a.m. session. Alt will want you available, not necessarily present. Your phone good for early calls? Yes, she said. Get some sleep. Working on it, she said, and got out. She didn't sleep much. Not because she was anxious exactly, but because her body was still running the biochemistry of a high-stakes day. The low-grade alertness that didn't know the emergency was functionally over. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and thought about the things she hadn't let herself think about while she was inside the building. 31 months. She'd spent 31 months at Sutter Ridge being the nurse nobody looked at carefully enough to see, and she'd told herself that was what she wanted. Quiet. Sustainable. Medicine at a pace that didn't cost her the way the other pace had cost her. She'd told herself that the invisibility was chosen, which was true in the sense that she'd built it deliberately, and not true in the sense that she'd also let it become the ceiling. Voss had been the visible evidence of something she'd let herself pretend was tolerable. The sideways comments, the September complaint she hadn't known about until today, the way a room accommodated him and contracted around her. She told herself it didn't matter because the work was what mattered. She'd been partly right and mostly wrong. She fell asleep at 1 a.m. and woke at 5:17 without an alarm. By 6:40, she was in the lobby of Sutter Ridge, which was quieter at this hour than it had been yesterday morning, but not empty. A different guard at the desk, not Gerald, a woman she recognized but didn't know, looked up at her and didn't question her presence, which meant word had moved to the overnight staff as well. Drum was already on the 4th floor. So was Alt, and the JAG officer, and 2 people she hadn't seen before who she later understood were from the State Attorney General's office. The conference room now had a whiteboard. The whiteboard had a timeline on it that started at 6:47 a.m., the time of Marcus Webb's ambulance call, and ended at a box labeled Prior Call with a timestamp of 6:48 p.m. She studied it. Everything that had seemed disjointed during the living of it was coherent in this form. The sequence was clear, and the sequence was damning, and the sequence left very little interpretive room for anyone who had been in it. At 7:02, the board session began in the main boardroom at the end of the corridor. Emily was not in the room for the first portion. Drum had told her the night before that she'd be called in, and she spent 40 minutes in the conference room with Foyle going over the statement she'd given the previous evening, not changing it, but making sure she understood which sections would be specifically referenced by the board. This was the kind of preparation she'd done before testimonies and field debriefings, and the rhythm was familiar even if the setting wasn't. Alt came to get her at 7:48. Achebe's running a tight room, he said, which was his version of a full briefing. Voss is in there. Steck is not. He was advised by his personal counsel not to attend. He held the boardroom door for her. The boardroom was a longer, darker room than the conference room. Oval table, 12 chairs, 4 of them occupied by board members she'd never met, 2 by men in suits she didn't recognize, 1 by Drum, 1 by Patricia Marlowe, and 1 by Harlan Voss. Voss looked like he'd slept worse than she had. He looked like a man who'd spent the night on the wrong side of his own intelligence, who'd reviewed his choices the way smart people review choices they shouldn't have made and found, with the particular horror of the analytically gifted, exactly where each one had gone wrong. His suit was correct. His posture was maintained, but there was something behind his eyes that had gone quiet in the way that things go quiet after the thing they were protecting is already gone. Dolores Achebe was at the head of the table. 60, or close to it, with the focused deliberateness of someone who had chaired enough meetings to know that control of the room began before the first word. She looked at Emily when she entered and said, "Ms. Doss, please sit down," and indicated the chair across from Voss. She sat. What followed was not a trial. Achebe was careful to frame it as an information-gathering session, which was accurate and also strategic. It allowed board members to ask direct questions without the formality of sworn testimony, which moved faster. Drum presented the investigation summary. Foyle presented the medical board's preliminary assessment. Marlowe gave a concise account of her OR findings and the phone call the previous evening, during which she did not editorialize and did not look at Voss. Voss's attorney, a man named Garrick, who had arrived at 6:55 and had spent the intervening time looking increasingly like he regretted taking a 6 a.m. call, advised him not to answer several questions. This was appropriate counsel. It was also not the shelter Voss might have hoped for, because the body camera footage was played for the board at 8:11 a.m. Nobody spoke during it. It was 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Emily had not watched it before. She watched it now from across the table from the man it documented, and she had the strange experience of seeing something she remembered from inside play out from the external angle of the bay's ceiling-mounted camera. She watched herself enter the room ahead of the gurney. She watched herself move the crash cart. She watched the gurney arrive and Voss take his position and the paramedic transfer his report. She watched herself make her assessment, saw her own hands on Marcus Webb's wrist, saw her own mouth form words that the audio captured clearly. She watched Voss tell her to step back. She watched herself not step back. She watched the tourniquet go on, and the marker on Webb's skin, and the blood pressure on the monitor starting its slow climb from 58 into something survivable. She watched Voss at the foot of the bed with his hands at his sides. When the footage ended, Achebe let the silence exist for a moment. Then she said, "Dr. Voss, your incident report states that the patient's hemodynamic status did not, in your clinical assessment, yet warrant the level of intervention applied." She looked at him. "I've just watched the patient arrive with a systolic of 58. Can you explain the basis for that assessment?" Garrick put a hand on Voss's arm. Voss said, "On advice of counsel." "I understand," Achebe said. She made a note. She moved on. By 9:30, the board had what it needed for immediate action. The deliberation took 11 minutes, during which Emily sat in the corridor with Alt and drank the worst coffee she'd ever encountered in a professional setting, which was saying something given her deployment history. Alt said, "How are you holding up?" She thought about the honest answer. "I've had worse days," she said, "but fewer that started and ended in the same building." 11 minutes is fast for a board, he said. "Achebe's running a tight room," she said, using his phrasing from earlier, and he looked at her with something like appreciation. The door opened. One of the board members, a woman in her 40s who'd been introduced as a physician member of the board, came to the doorway and said, "Ms. Doss, we'd like you back in the room." She went. Achebe said, "The board has voted to immediately suspend Dr. Voss's clinical privileges pending the completion of the State Medical Board's investigation. This action is effective as of this session and will be documented in his personnel record." She looked at Voss. "You'll receive formal written notice within 24 hours. Please surrender your access credentials to Dr. Foyle before you leave the building." Garrick was writing. Voss was very still. The architecture of his certainty had been gone since last night. She'd noted that. But there was something specific that happened in people when the institutional structure that had held them upright finally named the removal publicly and officially. She had seen it happen to people she'd respected and people she hadn't, and it never looked like relief. Additionally, Achebe said, the board has voted to overturn the termination of Emily Doss, effective immediately, with full restoration of her position, seniority, and compensation. She looked at Emily. "You'll receive a formal reinstatement letter today. Ms. Doss, on behalf of this board, want to say directly that the events of yesterday represent a failure of this institution's processes and its people. I don't want to dress that up." Emily said, "I appreciate that. I'd also like to discuss, when you're ready, what structural changes you think need to be made in the trauma department. But that's a separate conversation. She looked around the table. This session is adjourned. People moved. Garrick spoke quietly to Voss, who stood and gathered his jacket and did not look at Emily and walked toward the door with the particular posture of a man who had decided that posture was the last thing he could control. He almost made it. At the door he stopped. She didn't know why. Maybe he'd intended to leave clean, and something in the leaving had broken down. He turned back. He looked at her across the room, and his face had the quality of someone who had arrived at a calculation that cost more than he'd planned. "You were right," he said. "In the bay. Your assessment was right." She held his gaze. She didn't fill the silence because it wasn't hers to fill. He left. The room emptied gradually. Drum shook her hand and said he'd be in touch about the investigation's progress. Foyle said the medical board's formal review would take 3 to 4 months, but that her reinstatement was not contingent on its outcome. Marlowe caught her near the door and said, "Come find me when you're back on the floor," in a tone that was not sentimental, but was genuinely meant. Alt was the last to leave. He paused beside her. "Marcus is being transferred to a military medical facility this afternoon for recovery continuation," he said. "But he asked me to tell you something before we go." She waited. He said, "She knew what she was doing. Tell her we know it too." Alt looked at her steadily. "His whole team knows what happened here. That's not a small thing." "I know," she said. After he left, she stood alone in the boardroom for a moment. The whiteboard from the conference room was visible through the open connecting door, and the timeline on it went from 6:47 a.m. yesterday to 6:48 p.m., and everything that had happened between those two timestamps was now a matter of official record. She picked up her bag. She went to the elevator. She pressed the button for the ground floor, and while she was waiting for the doors to close, her phone buzzed with an email. Reinstatement letter from the hospital's administrative system. Time-stamped 9:44 a.m. She read the first line. Then she looked at her own reflection in the elevator doors. Dark hair, same knot she'd left home with yesterday morning, the same small scar on her left forearm she never explained. And she rode down to the ER. She had work to do. The doors opened on the ground floor and she stepped out, and Bev Quarles was at the nurse's station with a patient chart in one hand and the expression of a woman who had been following the story from below and had spent the night deciding where she stood. Bev looked at her. Emily looked back. "Bed 4 needs a new IV line," Bev said. Overnight nurse blew the vein. Emily set her bag behind the desk. "I'll take it," she said. She was halfway to bed 4 when her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Different from any of the unknowns from yesterday. She answered it because yesterday had trained her to answer unknowns. A woman's voice. Precise and unhurried, and carrying the specific authority of someone who did not make calls she wasn't certain about. "Ms. Doss, my name is Brigadier General Irene Tock. I'm the commanding officer of the Army Medical Command Special Operations Support Division." A pause. "I've received a full briefing on the events at Sutter Ridge over the past 24 hours, including your service record, your intervention yesterday morning, and the conduct of the investigation." Another pause, this one deliberate. "I'm calling because we'd like to speak with you about something. Not related to the investigation. Something else entirely." Emily stopped walking. "What kind of something?" she asked. "The kind," General Tock said, "that requires you to come to Washington." She stood in the middle of the ER corridor with her hand on the phone and the sounds of the department moving around her. Monitors, wheels, someone in Bay 2 asking for more blankets. And she said, "When?" "We'd like to arrange travel for next week," General Tock said. "I'll have someone contact you with logistics by end of day. I want to be clear. This is an invitation, not an order. You're a civilian." "What's the subject?" A pause that was shorter than it felt. "A program, early stage. We've been looking at a gap in how Special Operations Medical Support handles the transition between field medicine and civilian trauma integration. Your record from deployment and what happened yesterday morning are relevant to what we're trying to build." Another pause. "I'd rather explain it in person." Emily looked at the nurse's station. Bev Quarles was watching her with the peripheral attention of a woman who'd learned to track multiple things at once without appearing to track any of them. "Send the logistics," Emily said. "I'll be there." She hung up. She went to bed 4 and started the IV line, and her hands were steady, and the patient, a 72-year-old man named Harold who had opinions about the morning news, talked at her while she worked, and she listened with the part of her attention that wasn't still processing the call. And she got the line on the first try, and Harold said, "You're good at that." And she said, "I've had practice." And that was the next 20 minutes of her life, which was exactly what it needed to be. The weeks that followed did not move the way the 2 days of crisis had moved. They moved the way real institutional consequence moves, slowly, in documents, in hearings, in the accumulation of formal language around events that had already happened and couldn't be changed. Emily worked her shifts. She showed up, and she did her job, and the department around her was different in the specific way that departments are different after something interior is exposed. Not dramatic, not transformed, but recalibrated, as though everyone had quietly updated the coordinates they used to navigate the room. The State Medical Board's formal investigation was completed in 11 weeks. The report was 23 pages. Emily read all of it, which took 40 minutes, and found it accurate and thorough and written with the particular care of people who understood that documents like this one would be cited in other documents for years. Dr. Harlan Voss's clinical privileges were revoked. Not suspended, revoked, which was the word that meant the thing was not being held in reserve pending better behavior. The board found that he had provided materially false documentation in a patient care record, had attempted to suborn a colleague's testimony, and had demonstrated a pattern of conduct that prioritized institutional self-protection over clinical accuracy. His medical license entered a mandatory review process that, by the time the board's report was published, had already been initiated by 2 other states where he'd previously held privileges. He left Denton before the report was public. Emily didn't know where he went and didn't spend time thinking about it. She'd known people who'd spent years of their lives tracking what happened to the people who'd wronged them, and she'd watched that tracking cost them in ways that were hard to watch. She had his outcome on paper, which was what the paper was for. Raymond Steck resigned from his position as hospital director 6 days after the board session, in a letter that cited personal reasons and was accepted by Dolores Achebe with language that was formally gracious and substantively cold. The county DA's office opened a criminal inquiry into the document falsification in week 3. Emily gave a deposition that lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes in a conference room that was not on the 4th floor of Sutter Ridge, with a prosecutor who asked good questions and a defense attorney who asked the same 3 questions in different arrangements, which was a technique she'd seen before and which she answered the same way each time because the answer was the same each time. Steck pleaded to a reduced charge in month 4, criminal tampering with medical records, a Class C felony, and received a suspended sentence, a permanent bar from hospital administration, and a fine that represented approximately 8% of what he'd earned in his final year at Sutter Ridge. Emily thought the fine was inadequate. She said so, once, to Torres, who was the only person she said it to. Then she moved on, because the alternative was to hold her judgment of the sentence as a weight she carried, and she had carried enough things that weren't hers to carry. Diane Pryor received a formal reprimand from the state HR licensing board for her role in processing the termination without adequate independent review. She kept her credentials. Emily had no strong feeling about this. Pryor had made a bad call in a pressured moment and then, at professional risk without being asked, had called to correct it. People were not one thing. Torres was promoted to charge nurse in week 8, which was both deserved and faster than it would have been if the department hadn't needed to fill the supervisory gap left by Bev Quarles, who had announced her retirement effective end of year. Bev told Emily on her last day that she'd been planning to retire for 2 years and had been waiting for the department to be in a shape she could leave it in good conscience. Emily wasn't sure how to take that, and Bev, who had 9 years of reading silences, said, "Take it as a compliment. I stayed until there was someone worth staying for." The trip to Washington happened in week 3. Emily flew out on a Wednesday. She wore civilian clothes because she was a civilian, and she took a window seat because she'd learned on deployments that window seats gave you information about where you were, and she watched Montana flatten into the continental expanse and thought about what she was flying toward. General Tuck's office was in a building that was what buildings in Washington were: solid, institutional, carrying the specific weight of accumulated decisions. Tuck herself was what her voice had suggested. precise and unhurried, with the kind of face that had decided a long time ago that expression was something to deploy rather than leak. She was 60 or close to it, and she'd been in military medicine for 35 years, which meant she'd been inside the same world Emily had been inside, just from a different angle and for longer. They shook hands and Talk said, "Thank you for coming." Emily said, "Thank you for calling." And she meant it, which Talk appeared to register. What Talk described over the next 90 minutes was not a position, exactly, and not a program in the bureaucratic sense of something with a budget line in a department. It was a gap. Specifically, the gap between what special operations medics were trained to do in the field and what happened to those skills and those medics when they transitioned to civilian practice. The gap between combat medicine's pragmatic, make it work with what you have approach, and civilian medicine's protocol-heavy, hierarchy-dependent structure. The gap that produced situations where trained people froze in civilian environments because the authority structure was wrong, or where civilian systems failed because the trained people in the room had been systematically discouraged from acting like what they were. What happened at Sutter Ridge, Talk said, is not unique. "I know," Emily said. "It's a pattern. The skills don't leave, the training doesn't leave. But the context changes and the institutions don't know what to do with people who've operated at a different level of autonomy, and so they either absorb them badly or reject them outright." She paused. "We want to build a bridge, a formal one, a program that works on both ends, improving how combat medics transition into civilian clinical environments, and improving how civilian trauma departments integrate personnel with special operations medical backgrounds." Emily said, "What would my role be?" "Advisory, initially. We want people who've lived both sides. You have the deployment record. You have the civilian trauma experience. And you have—" She paused, choosing her word carefully. "A documented case study, as of 3 weeks ago, of exactly the kind of institutional failure the program is designed to prevent." Emily was quiet for a moment. "I have a job," she said. "I know. The program doesn't require you to leave it. What we're proposing is a consulting role alongside your clinical work. Site visits, curriculum review, testimony at training sessions." Talk met her eyes. "Your name carries weight now, not because of what happened to you, because of what you did." Emily looked at the window. Outside, Washington was doing what Washington did in December. Cold, gray, determined to be indifferent to the cold and gray. She thought about Sutter Ridge, about 31 months of useful invisibility, about the specific choice she'd made to be unremarkable, and what that choice had cost her, and what it had protected her from, and whether the ratio had ever been right. She thought about Marcus Webb at 10:02 in the morning, his eyes doing the things she'd seen before, and the tourniquet in her hands, and the fact that the only reason she knew what to do was that she'd done it before, in places that had asked everything of her, and given her something back she couldn't name but couldn't discard. "Okay," she said. Talk looked at her. "That's it? Okay. Did you want more?" The corner of Talk's mouth moved. "No," she said. "Okay works." The formal agreement was signed in January. It was modest in document terms. 4 pages, quarterly review, clearly defined boundaries on Emily's time and availability. But it was real, which was the thing that mattered. It was the kind of real that appeared in official places and changed what was structurally possible. She flew home from Washington on a Thursday night and got back to Denton at 11 p.m. and took the bus from the airport because the bus ran late on Thursdays, and stood at the stop in the cold for 8 minutes, and rode home with her bag on her lap and her coat buttoned against the heat that never quite worked in the back of the bus. She was back at Sutter Ridge the next morning at 6:48 because that was when her shift started, and because nothing about what had happened made the shift start later. The department had changed in the ways that departments change when something internal shifts, but the external architecture stays the same. The supply room was reorganized. She'd worked with Bev's replacement on that, a quiet, practical conversation about what was actually needed where, and the reorganization had happened without drama because it was simply correct and nobody who understood the work had a reason to object. The monitoring protocol in Bay 3 had been updated, which had been on Emily's list since October. Torres ran morning briefings with a directness that was his own version of authority, different from Bev's, not better or worse, just his. She worked her shifts, she fixed what she could fix. She documented what needed documenting and flagged what needed flagging and answered questions from the younger nurses with the directness she wished someone had offered her earlier, without ceremony and without condescension. She started the Washington consulting work in February. The first site visit was to a trauma center in Arizona that had 3 former combat medics on staff, all of them functioning below their actual capability level because the department's hierarchy hadn't figured out how to use what they had. She spent 2 days there. She wasn't diplomatic in the soft sense, but she was precise, and precision, she'd found, was more useful than diplomatic when the goal was actually changing something. The department director, a woman who'd been in medicine for 20 years and was smart enough to know when someone was telling her something true, listened to all of it and said, "Come back in 6 months and tell me what's still wrong." Emily said she would. The formal outcome of the Sutter Ridge investigation was published in a state medical board bulletin in early spring. 4 pages summarizing the Voss case, 3 pages on the Steck matter, 2 pages of recommended protocol changes for incident report modification controls that several other hospital systems in the state were asked to implement. Emily's name appeared twice in the bulletin, both times in clinical contexts, which was how she preferred it. It also appeared in a different document that same week, on a formal military commendation letter signed by Brigadier General Tak and countersigned by Commander Ault. The language was specific and without flattery. Recognition of Emily Doss for extraordinary clinical intervention under institutional pressure, for maintaining competence and composure in a civilian emergency consistent with the highest standards of Special Operations medical support, and for her subsequent contribution to the Army Medical Command's Transitional Care Initiative. Torres printed it off the hospital bulletin board where someone, he claimed he didn't know who, and she suspected he was lying, had posted it, and he gave it to her in the break room on a Tuesday afternoon with the expression of a man performing a neutral act that was not neutral. She looked at it. She looked at him. "Who posted it?" she asked. "I genuinely don't know," he said, with the face of someone who genuinely did know. She folded it and put it in her jacket pocket and went back to work. Marcus Webb came back to Sutter Ridge in April, not as a patient. He walked through the main entrance on a Wednesday afternoon, which was the first genuinely warm day of the year in Denton, with Reyes behind him and a slight favoring of his right leg that she suspected he was working to eliminate through the kind of physical rehabilitation program that didn't accept setbacks as information, only as obstacles. He was in civilian clothes. He looked like a man who had been broken and repaired and was now engaged in the slow work of establishing the new load-bearing capacity. He found her in Bay 4 where she was discharging a patient. He waited in the corridor. She saw him through the curtain gap, and she finished the discharge because that was what the moment required, and then she came out. They stood in the corridor. "You look better than the last time I saw you," she said. "Bar was low," he said. It was. He was quiet for a moment. He was the kind of man who thought before he spoke, which she'd noticed in the recovery room and was confirmed now. "I wanted to come back here," he said. "I wanted to see you in the place it happened." She didn't say anything. "I've been doing this job for 11 years, he said. "I've been in situations where someone's hands were the difference. You know what I mean." "Yes," she said. "Most of those times, the person who made the difference knew they were going to be in that situation, trained for it, prepared for it." He looked at her. "You walked into a Tuesday morning and did it anyway, in a building full of people who'd been telling you to be smaller." She held his gaze. "It wasn't heroism," she said, because she needed to say that. "It was just not stopping." "I know," he said. "That's what I'm talking about." He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was what she expected from a man who used his hands professionally. Not a demonstration, just a fact. He left with Reyes, and she stood in the corridor for a moment, and Torres came by with a chart and glanced at her and said nothing, which was the right call. She went back to work. Here is what nobody told Emily Doss when she transitioned from the Army to a hospital in Denton, Montana, and what she had to arrive at herself, the hard way. The skills you earn in the field don't belong to the field. They belong to you. The 14 years, the decisions made in bad light with inadequate equipment, the knowledge of exactly what a body can survive and exactly what it can't, that doesn't transfer to an institution. It transfers to the person. Institutions can tell you you're small. They can build systems that make smallness the condition of belonging. They can file reports, modify documents, call meetings without chairs, escort you out of buildings you've served faithfully, and do all of it with the complete confidence that the architecture of authority protects them. What they can't do is reach inside you and remove what you know. Emily Doss didn't save Marcus Webb because the system worked. She saved him because she didn't wait for the system to catch up to the emergency. She had been trained, in the most demanding circumstances available, to read a situation correctly and act without permission, and when the moment came, she did not apologize for her training. She did not make herself smaller so that the room could be more comfortable. She moved, and she did not stop, and a man lived. What happened to her afterward was unjust. There's no framework in which firing the nurse who saved your patient makes institutional sense unless the institution is trying to protect something that isn't the patient. The cover-up was not a failure of judgment. It was a choice, made deliberately, by people who had decided that their professional comfort was worth more than the truth. That choice had consequences, the way choices always do, documented in 23 pages and a criminal plea and a permanent license revocation. None of that would have happened if Diane Pryor hadn't made a different call at 6:48 p.m. None of it would have happened if Torres had stayed quiet. None of it would have happened if Patricia Marlowe hadn't picked up the phone and pressed record. The reversal wasn't Emily alone. It was every person in the building who decided one at a time that there was a line they wouldn't cross. That's what institutional change actually looks like from the inside. Not a single hero. A sequence of people choosing correctly at increasing personal cost until the weight of all those choices becomes something the institution cannot sustain against. Emily knew this. She'd known it since she sat in the lobby that Tuesday morning watching elevator numbers, waiting without knowing exactly what she was waiting for. She'd known it when Pryor's voice came through the phone, stripped of its administrative distance. She'd known it in the way Marcus Webb had looked at her in the recovery room, not with gratitude exactly, but with the recognition of one trained person for another. By summer, the trauma department at Sutter Ridge had a new protocol for flagging monitoring concerns in Bay 3, Emily's protocol, submitted through proper channels and approved without resistance by the interim director, a woman named Dr. Sean Okafor, who had been brought in from Portland and who had, in her first week, asked Emily to walk her through the department's actual workflow rather than its documented one. The difference between those two things had been instructive. Emily's reinstatement letter had specified full restoration of seniority and compensation. What it couldn't specify, and what happened anyway, was the change in the room when she walked into it. Not deference, she didn't want deference, but attention. The kind of attention that meant people were actually looking at what she was saying, incorporating it, updating their understanding. The kind of attention that should have been there from the beginning and wasn't, and now was. She didn't gloat about this. She had no interest in gloating. She had work to do. There were nurses in that department who were 24, 25 years old, who were learning what it meant to be competent inside an institution that didn't always reward competence. She watched them navigate what she had navigated, and she told them what she wished she'd been told, which was not that the system was rigged, because that was incomplete, and not that the system was fair, because that was worse. What she told them was this: know what you know, document what you see. Don't shrink your assessment to fit someone else's comfort level. And when the moment comes, and the moment always comes, don't stop. They listened. Some of them had the look of people who were listening politely and would forget by Friday. Some of them had the look of people who were filing it in a place they wouldn't lose it. That was enough. You couldn't control what they did with it. You could only offer it clearly. On the last day of the hospital's fiscal year, Dolores Achebe called Emily to her office. Not the boardroom, her actual office. Smaller and more personal, with a window that looked out over the parking lot and a desk covered in the productive disorder of someone who was genuinely working rather than performing work. She offered Emily a seat and a coffee, and the coffee was better than anything available in the rest of the building, which Emily noted without comment. I want to talk to you about the clinical review committee, Achebe said. We're restructuring it. I want nursing represented at the actual decision-making level, not in an advisory capacity. Emily looked at her. I want you to chair the trauma subcommittee, Achebe said. That's a formal board-appointed position. It means protocol review, incident investigation, and direct reporting access to the full board. She met Emily's eyes. It means when something happens in that department, you're the one who decides whether it gets scrutinized. Emily sat with that for a moment. That's a significant change from how this hospital has operated, she said. Yes, Achebe said. That's the point. Emily thought about the version of herself that had walked out of this building on a November morning with a bag on her shoulder and 34 degrees pressing in from all directions, who had stood on the sidewalk for 40 seconds and started walking toward the bus stop, who had turned back not because it was the strategic move, not because she'd calculated an advantage, but because the situation wasn't finished and she knew it. She thought about what it had cost. She thought about what it had returned. "I'll take it," she said. Achebe nodded. No theatrical moment, no applause. Just the acknowledgement of one practical person to another that the right decision had been made and there was work attached to it. Emily walked out of Achebe's office and down the corridor toward the ER, and the hospital around her was a real place. Imperfect, underfunded in some areas, over-proceduralized in others, full of people doing demanding work at varying levels of skill and integrity, the way every institution was. It was not fixed. It would never be fully fixed, because institutions are made of people, and people are imperfect by construction, which is not a counsel of despair, but a description of the actual terrain. What she had now, that she hadn't had 11 months ago, was a seat at the table where the terrain got mapped. That wasn't small. She pushed through the ER doors. The department received her without ceremony, the way it received everyone who belonged there. Someone called her name from Bay 2. She redirected. She started her shift. The quiet woman from the bus had not become someone else. She had become more fully herself, which was the only transformation that held. That was what they couldn't take when they took everything. That was what waited, intact, when she walked back in. It doesn't announce itself, that kind of strength. It doesn't need to. It shows up when it's needed, does what the moment requires, writes the time on the wound and marker so no one forgets when the clock started and keeps going. That's all it ever was. That's everything it ever needed to be.